Hello everyone, I decided to record this because I've had a lot of questions lately about coronavirus. What does it mean? How worried should we be? How are we going to make decisions? And so I thought it would be good to put some numbers behind all of this. So the best spot that I usually go to right now to kind of see what's going on with the coronavirus update is this Johns Hopkins subsite. Website. I think it's a good visual. Kind of helps you get an understanding of how far it's spreading across the world, and it's updated almost every hour, basically. The first question we had when coronavirus came out, one of them was how infectious was it? Would it spread rapidly? And I think that's pretty much already been answered. If you look at the number of dots worldwide, it's unfortunately quite a bit more infectious than we were worried, so it's spread pretty rapidly across the world. The next question, though, is how many people are going to die from it? What's the case fatality rate? And that's a little hard to figure out, and that number I think is a little too early, but I think if you break down the numbers and look at pieces of it, I think you get some better idea of how fatal it actually is. So if you look at worldwide, our case fatality rate so far is about 3.5%. I've seen people theorizing it's anywhere from 1 to 3%. I think those estimates are actually quite high. And the hint about that is to look at the subgroups here and seeing which countries are which. And you'll notice that some countries are pretty low, below 1%, where others are higher. I think the reason for this is partly due to, in health statistics, what I would call a denominator problem. And a way to explain that is if you look at the denominator, numerator and denominator, the top's pretty easy. I mean, deaths is pretty hard to hide. There's not a lot of gray area, dead, not dead. But the problem is the denominator is very fuzzy. So identified cases, if you only look at identified cases, it looks like worldwide we have a case fatality rate of 3.7%. But those aren't all the cases. We also have lots of unidentified cases, and those vary dramatically across countries based on their ability to do good surveillance of the disease. And so the real case fatality rate is actually quite a bit lower than this. So one way to look at it, if you look at each group, you'll see that some countries are much lower than other countries. China's pretty high. They have a lot of unidentified cases because it started there first. They had to develop a test, took them a lot of time to get there, so there were quite probably maybe at least double or triple those numbers that were not identified. You can kind of see that unfortunately some countries all have numbers in the same range. These are countries that probably did a bad job of surveillance or a little behind. Italy, Iran, the United States. Unfortunately, we know in the United States that the CDC was kind of slow in shipping out tests, and some of the tests were actually flawed initially, and so they're kind of playing catch up, trying to get enough test kits out there. However, if you look at the other countries, you see that they have lower case fatality rates, and I think what's happening here is they're doing a better job of identifying their cases. And the way it would look is like this. And so if you add the numbers for France, Germany, Japan, and South Korea, countries that have probably done a pretty good job of surveillance and also have developed world health care, so when people are sick, they've got a good way to treat them. If you look at them, the deaths are 75 and the identified cases are 10,050, giving you a case fatality rate of 0.7%. And there's still probably quite a few unidentified cases yet, so likely even this still overstates the actual case fatality rate. So although unfortunately it looks like coronavirus is very infectious, it looks like the case fatality rate is actually lower than feared. My guess is it's probably going to be a bit lower than 0.7%, maybe 0.5, although it will be vary a little bit based on the healthcare system in your country and how prepared we are and how fast it hits, which I think goes to kind of into some decision making about how we're going to respond to this. So one thing to put in perspective, though, is with a case fatality of 0.5%, that means 99.5% of us will not die for coronavirus. So it's important not to panic and overreact because most of us are going to be fine. Also, I think for me, most importantly, is that healthy children and young adults are not at risk. This would be a huge problem to the world and our economy if the healthy children and young adults were also at risk, but they're not. So that's a good thing. The bad thing, though, is still 0.5% is still a lot of people, and elderly people with heart disease, smokers, etc. If I add different combinations, their case fatality rates could be in the 3 to 20% range, which is still a lot of people. This may not sound a lot, but it might help to kind of put it into a community perspective. So here in Lincoln, Nebraska, we have roughly 300,000 people in our community. It's probably unlikely that everybody will get infected. Probably more, maybe say like 40%. There are people who won't get infected. They'll do a good job of washing their hands, keeping themselves isolated, or they may just for some reason not develop the infection. But let's say for ease of math, 300,000 people, 40,000 infected. That's 120,000. Most of those are not going to be that ill. It might be cough, cold, maybe even a bad case of the influenza-like symptoms, but beyond that, not too bad. Maybe 5% are severely ill. That's about 6,000 people. That's still quite a lot to take care of, and 0.5% of those, if it's a case fatality rate, would be about 600. Not a huge amount of deaths, but still quite a lot of people dying. And also, this case fatality rate also means we have assumes that we take good care of these 6,000 people. Well, one thing we need to start thinking of, and that's why the rationale behind some of the school closings, is if we overwhelm our healthcare system by too many people getting sick at once, this case fatality rate could actually be higher because we might not have the resources to treat everybody. A way to think of that is if everybody gets sick really quickly, so we need a ton of health care in a very short amount of time. If we can slow down the infection, that means we'll have the same amount of people, but the peak would be delayed. We'd have a lot more time, to take care of people for a few weeks. This would give us some time to prepare if we could slow down the epidemic. So this is why the one of the options is closing schools, canceling concerts and sporting events, because that would slow down the spread in an attempt to slow the peak. We also could home isolate high-risk individuals, and this would give us more time to plan and prepare, and also make it so that as this wave of sick people hits our healthcare system, we can actually have an adequate amount of resources to take care of them. So this is likely one of our responses coming up in the near future, as we maybe do some closings and cancellations of things. However, we can't close schools forever. If we close down schools, cancel all these events, at some point it becomes too much of an economic burden on the community. Closing the schools is kind of an interesting look in that children are not at risk. So we're not closing the schools to benefit the children at all. We're actually doing it to benefit the community's response to coronavirus. But that's our schools part of the role they need to play in the community. But there are also downsides to closing the schools for too long. We need the schools to teach our students. They also provide meals for a lot of low-income students, so we need to figure out what we're going to do if we're going to send them home for a few weeks at a time, how we can get food to those families. Also, closing creates a childcare crisis for the economy. If all of our parents suddenly got to find childcare, there may not be enough childcare, and that means people can't go to work. It could also put loads on the healthcare workforce, because a lot of our healthcare workforce, maybe 10 to 20% of our community, will be working overtime trying to take care of those sick people. The last thing they need to worry about is having to take care of their kids, so maybe we need their kids back in schools so that they can concentrate on their work. So this will probably potentially put a bookend to how long we might close the schools, for example. So the other thing that also gives us some hope is if you look at the Johns Hopkins site, you'll see this orange line. This is that the spread in China seems to have slowed down. So there's probably a couple things. One, that their response, meaning closing the schools and closing everything down, probably did slow down their response, so it tells you that's probably effective. The other hope we have is this a seasonal disease? So for example, some influenza, it will typically slow down in the spring when the weather gets warm. It has something to do with humidity, how many people are inside. So having people outside, not in closed-sized spaces, or even just the changes in the weather, could slow their response. So there's a chance that coronavirus will slow down just because of the weather changing, and that could also give us a reprieve until maybe it rebounds this fall. So again, so perspective, in Lincoln, Nebraska, we're probably in the we'll probably need to prepare to take care of thousands of sick people here in the next few months. The case fatality rates, we could be talking, 600, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people dead at most. Still, it's tragic, but it's not Armageddon though either. The big thing I think we need to start worrying about our community is how are we going to take care of this many sick people at once. So hopefully that's helpful and gives you some background to the coronavirus epidemic, and hopefully we'll of course have better answers in the next few weeks as we get better data.